I think it's very, very helpful, and I think it's really valuable that Brazil has done this. I think it tells us a lot about where Brazil sees itself as going. I think on a range of visa-related issues, Brazil is increasingly seeing itself as a country that has something unique to offer, and that can provide a bridge between the West and, let's, for want of a better phrase, say the global South, or for non-aligned countries. And we see Brazil taking a similar tack in relation to peacekeeping and peace building, for example, in its role in Haiti, and articulating a new account of peacekeeping that places emphasis on peace building. So I hugely applaud Brazil for doing what it's doing, and I think it really helped yesterday in terms of providing a hook that member states could use in order to think about the concerns that they have. Now, there's a couple of issues that were in the original concept note that Brazil circulated that I had issue with. And what was interesting yesterday is that the Brazilian statement showed recognition of that, and some other member states didn't. The first one was this whole issue of sequencing that came up again and again. In the original Brazilian concept note, it spoke of chronological sequencing. Yesterday, the Brazilian Perm Rep spoke about prudential and political sequencing. So the sequencing should be done on the basis that makes sense on a case basis. And I think that is an entirely sensible way of doing it. There are a number of problems with the idea of chronological sequencing. That is, you've got to go through Pillar 1, then to Pillar 2, then to Pillar 3. First one is that it's inconsistent with the UN Charter. Article 42 of the Charter says that before the Council moves to enforcement measures, it must be assured that peaceful measures are unlikely to succeed. Doesn't say that the Council must work through them, work through a checklist before. It just says the Council needs to be satisfied that those other measures wouldn't work. And clearly, I think a member state on the Council, certainly one thinking about committing its own resources, would not decide to commit troops and lots of money to a military intervention when it thinks there are cheaper, peaceful, less dangerous ways of achieving the same result. So that's the first thing. Second thing I'd say is it's also inconsistent with what was agreed in 2005. There is no chronological sequencing in paragraphs 138, 139. In fact, paragraph 139, when it comes to Pillar 3, uses the language of Article 42 of the UN Charter. It doesn't say that member states can only go, or the Security Council can only go to Chapter 7 measures after all the other measures have failed. It says it can do so after the other measures are judged likely to be ineffective, or it's wording to that effect. But it's the same sort of wording that you find in Article 42. It very clearly is saying you don't have to get out your checklist and steadily go through them all before you get to the use of force. And that's entirely consistent with the principle of last resort. So the principle of last resort comes from just war thinking, a topic that I used to do a lot of writing on. And what the principle of last resort means is not that you have to have tried everything else first, because you can always keep trying everything else. You can try and negotiate right up until there's only one person left alive. It requires that you try everything else that you think is likely, or that looks likely to achieve the result that you want. And if nothing else is likely to work, then that's when you've recourse to force or other enforcement measures. The third issue I have with it is it's just impossible to work in practice. I mean, what does chronological sequencing look like when the genocide in Rwanda starts? When you start to think through, and this is, I think we sometimes get a bit too hung up on the pillars. The pillars were a sort of analytical device for making sense of what was agreed in 2005. But what was agreed in 2005 doesn't speak about pillars. So these are not legal concepts. They're not even a core part of the principle itself. They're just a way of understanding how the principle works and the way in which the Secretary General framed his approach to implementing the principle. And I think there's sometimes a bit of confusion about that. And then the final thing, which is related to the third, is that I think it's morally troubling. Are you really saying that when Rwanda genocide starts, we should send a fact-finding mission for a couple of weeks, and then when they've mull on their findings for a couple of weeks, and then maybe dispatch a mediator, give the mediator a month or two maybe, and then when you finally realise that that's failed, maybe we try observers, and then maybe we start with unarmed observers, and then get to armed observers, and then maybe traditional peacekeepers. If you do that, you find that your response to Rwanda was almost identical to the international community's actual response to Rwanda, which everyone in the room yesterday agreed was a failure for the whole of the UN system, in the words of the report. And I was thinking about Rwanda in that context, and I was thinking, well, actually sequencing is a bit like what happened when the commander of UNAMIR sent a message back to New York saying, look, we've got this intelligence that says militia groups are arming, they're developing lists of names of people. I think these are people who they intend to be victims and they're arming in order to kill these. I would like permission to go and disarm these groups. The response from New York was, you should go and tell the government of Rwanda about this and cooperate with them. When of course it was the government of Rwanda who were the very people supporting the militias who were... So in a sense it was not taking the risk seriously and thinking that we need a gradient approach, but contributed to the failure to properly pick up the warning signs that were very real and were very clearly expressed by the UN mission in the field, and deal with that at an earlier stage. Now, of course, we're all wise with hindsight, but with that hindsight, it seems possible at least that some robust action from UNAMIR and some strong words from New York could have done something to prevent or stem what then happened in Rwanda. So I think that's a long way of saying I think chronological sequencing is a problem. I think Brazil recognises that and so has changed the idea. That doesn't diminish the idea that force should always be a last resort. Of course it should. Nor does it weaken. There are some people who suggest it weakens pillars 1 and 2. I don't think it weakens pillars 1 and 2 at all. In fact, when I think of pillar 1, I think, well, states should be doing this all the time anyway. All pillar 1 does is reiterate legal obligations that states already have. Sometimes states don't do that. Sometimes they lack the capacity to do that. Sometimes when it's non-state actors abusing civilian, states lack the capacity. And that's where pillar 2 comes in. And we need to think more about pillar 2. Because we all say that we support pillar 2, that we want to do more pillar 2, but there's been it's not become part of our habit. Neither the UN nor regional arrangements are systematically in the business of helping states to build capacities to prevent genocide and mass atrocities. And we need to think about how we get the international community into the habit of assisting states in that way. And I think once we build those sorts of habits, then some of the other issues become less problematic.